My name is Anne Gramiak, and I am the Senior Manager of the Epilepsy Leadership Council and Partnerships at the American Epilepsy Society and a member of the PAME Governance Committee. For those of you who may be new to PAME, our mission is to convene, educate, and inspire all stakeholders, from the bereaved to those living with epilepsy, to healthcare professionals, advocates, clinical and basic scientists, and death investigators, to promote understanding and drive the prevention of epilepsy-related mortality. In recognition of International Epilepsy Day, which was February 13th, PAME wanted to continue to shine the light on epilepsy-related mortality in other parts of the world, especially lower income countries, where the risk of dying from epilepsy is that much greater. Before we get started, I would like to recognize the organizations that supported PAME's December conference and this 2023 webinar series. I would like to also thank all of you for joining us today, and of course for your patience through our technical delay. I encourage you to submit questions for our speakers using the question and answer feature of Zoom. This will help us track your questions for the discussion following our presentations, and then use the chat feature to connect with other attendees. We are recording this webinar, and the recording will be posted on PAME's website within 24 hours. You will receive an email once that is available. We are so honored today to have two incredible advocates for global epilepsy. Each of them brings extremely valuable insights into how we can better work as a community to narrow the epilepsy treatment gap, as well as prevent premature death associated with epilepsy. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Arjune Sen, head of the Oxford Epilepsy Research Group and consultant neurologist at the John Radcliffe Hospital. He is also a National Institute for Health and Care Research Biomedical Research Center Senior Research Fellow in Epileptology and an Associate Professor at the University of Oxford. He is interested in global epileptology and comorbidities experienced by people with epilepsy. Our second speaker is Amos, who has epilepsy and serves as the Vice President for Africa for the International Bureau of Epilepsy, which has 28 affiliates throughout the continent. He oversees the initiative Making Epilepsy a Health Priority in Africa. He previously served as the National Epilepsy Association of Malawi's chairperson, and he holds an MSc in Mental Health in Children and Young People from the University of Edinburgh, an MBA in Leadership and Sustainability from the UK, and a BA in Development Studies from Ireland, and a postgraduate diploma in Disability and Rehabilitation Management from Zambia. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Sen.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I too am sorry about the technical difficulties, and thank you, Anne, for getting us through everything and for the kind introduction. I seem to have lost hair since that previous photo, just in terms of what's been happening over the last 10 to 15 minutes or so. So I'm going to try and share my screen, and hopefully that will work okay. And hopefully you can all see the slides and see the slide in slideshow mode. I think my video's been affected, but I'll press on if that's okay. And will that be okay?
Actually, if you go up to the top and in the display settings, change from presenter mode, select the other one. There you go.
Okay. Is that projecting correctly now? Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. So sorry for all of those technical difficulties, and thanks very much to Anne and PAME and to Gardner for inviting me to speak today on this very important topic of understanding the global burden of epilepsy and trying to reduce stigma in low-income countries, with a view in due course to reducing the risks associated with epilepsy and mortality associated with the condition. In terms of the outline for this talk, we're going to talk about the background to epilepsy in resource-limited settings, explain why epilepsy really is an inequitable disorder, talk about mortality in people with epilepsy with a specific focus on low to middle income countries, and discuss about how preventing epilepsy might be possible, particularly in those settings. Welcome questions throughout, and also if people want to contact me after the webinar, then my email will be available if there's anything that I can answer or help with. Now, we all know this, and we're all interested in epilepsy and interested in helping people with epilepsy. And for years, we have been saying that epilepsy is the most common and serious neurological condition. And now we have additional support for that, because in 2019, epilepsy was declared a public health imperative by the World Health Organization. And this is the part of a journey, the start of a journey really, that we can really look to reshape epilepsy management, particularly with the WHO IGAP, which I'll allude to towards the end of the talk. So why did the World Health Organization choose to highlight epilepsy in this way? Well, epilepsy is common. It affects 50 million people, 80% of whom live in low to middle income countries. And particularly in those settings, there is a vast diagnostic gap and a very significant treatment gap. So the diagnostic gap refers to people with epilepsy who can't be diagnosed for a variety of reasons. And the treatment gap relates to people who have been diagnosed with epilepsy, but are not receiving appropriate treatment for that condition. There's an increased risk associated with epilepsy related to injury, burns, head injury, and so on and so forth. And as everyone on this webinar will be familiar, associates with the risk of mortality. Particularly in low-income settings, there are many treatable causes for epilepsy, and a theme through this talk will be that if we can prevent epilepsy, then inevitably we prevent epilepsy-associated mortality. It's important to remember that the psychosocial impact of epilepsy can be vast, associated with stigmatization that pervades employment, education, relationships, and so on and so forth. And we're very privileged to have Action here to talk about this in the second half of the webinar. So in terms of the diagnostic gap, this is one of my favorite slides, and I try and show it a lot. This is me in Zimbabwe with Dr. Gift Ngwende. Zimbabwe has a population of around 16 million people. And by my arriving in Zimbabwe, I doubled the number of neurologists in the country. So Gift at that time was the only neurologist for 16 million people. And so when I left, I halved the number of neurologists. There are now 2 neurologists in Zimbabwe, and that's Gift, who's here, and this is Lennon here. And I was very pleased with this photo as well. Look at the smile here. This is a collaborator meeting that we held in November in Oxford for a variety of collaborators across low to middle income settings. But when I showed this to colleagues, they said, so there are 2 neurologists in Zimbabwe and they're both in Oxford. And that quietened me somewhat, but it does illustrate how significant the diagnostic gap can be in these settings. And there's a lack of neurologists, a lack of specialist nurses, but also a lack of infrastructure in terms of, for example, scanners and EEGs. And there is, as you will all know, no point in placing an MRI scanner in a low resource setting unless there are people who can service the scanner, who can read the scans that are being produced by the machine, and so on and so forth. Similarly for EEG. There are also significant gaps in the diagnostic pathways. If someone in the UK, if someone in the John Radcliffe came having had a seizure to the accident emergency department, they would then be referred to the first seizure clinic. But that pathway isn't the same around the world. And it varies from country to country and setting to setting. But quite often in low to middle income countries, people will initially see a traditional healer or a faith healer prior to exploring contact with a doctor. And faith healers can perform a wide variety of ceremonies and sort of treatment with water and lots of other things to try and help people with seizures, but very different to conventional medicine. And this has pervaded the course of humanity. So here, for example, someone from the 15th century being taken to a priest in the context of a seizure. And at this time, this is from Julius Caesar's time, Julius Caesar had epilepsy. And at the time of Julius Caesar, a treatment for epilepsy was gladiator blood. And so people would wait with small clay pots to collect the blood from gladiators as they were being dragged out of the Colosseum or some other arena, and then rush home with the blood, give that to the relative or the friend who is having the seizure. And because seizures stop anyway, generally stop anyway after an interval, if you give the blood, the seizure may stop, but the seizure may have stopped anyway. But there becomes an association between drinking the blood and the cessation of the seizure, and so the myths perpetuate. And so if we have a diagnostic gap, and if we have a treatment gap, and if we have a gap in the epilepsy pathways, well, that can result in harm. And this is disability-adjusted life years shown across the world. And the more red the coloration, the higher the risk. And you can see that there is a preponderance of risk in sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of mortality in epilepsy, many people here will be familiar with these data. So most studies describe an increased risk of premature mortality, 2 to 3 times that of the general population, perhaps a bit more in men, higher in children, lower in those over the age of 75. And in the UK, it is thought that 21 people per week succumb to epilepsy-related mortality, and half of those are preventable. This is a summary slide from a variety of countries, mainly high-income settings, looking at the standardized mortality ratio. Again, this will be familiar, but we need to contextualize today all of these data from a low-income setting, and 80% of all epilepsy-related mortality is in low to middle-income countries. While epilepsy-related mortality has overall declined between 1990 and 2016, and this is work from the Global Burden of Disease surveys, the least improvement, the least decline has been seen in low to middle-income countries. And in 13 African countries, mortality actually increased. Looking at mortality in those settings, annual mortality rate has been quoted at around 19.8 per 1,000 people, and an SMR, standardized mortality ratio, of 2.6, again slightly higher in males, higher in children and adolescents. And the causes can either be attributable directly to the epilepsy or indirectly, and we'll come on to discuss that a little bit more in a moment. So I also trawled the literature and then summarized the papers that I could find looking specifically at mortality related to epilepsy in low-income settings. And you can see that there are not many studies, and they tend to look at things in slightly different ways. So, for example, the top study looked in 5-year intervals over a 20-year time horizon and looked at death certificates and identified 881 people who had died from convulsions, and then looked at the demographics of that associated with convulsions. So convulsions associated with increased risk in infancy, although the study included febrile convulsions, there could be chest complications, drowning, burns, and status epilepticus. If you look here in Bangladesh, so this was a study looking at people who had died consequent to an injury, and of 316 injury-related deaths, 12 people had epilepsy, and of those 12, 10 succumbed owing to drowning and 2 from burns. So it accounted for a total of 3.8% of injury-related fatalities. There are cases of SUDEP that are reported as well, although it can be quite difficult, and there are caveats, definite caveats to these data. Firstly, if epilepsy is not diagnosed, how do you diagnose epilepsy-related mortality? And the cause of mortality is listed on the death certificates can vary, and that's in high-income settings as well as low-income settings. But it does seem to be the case that a lot of the excess mortality in low-income settings relates to problems with access to care, and from preventable causes. We know that the risk of death can be increased early after diagnosis of epilepsy. We've touched on this a few times. Also, if there's a lesional cause to the seizures or a functional neurological deficit. And again, this will be familiar. So mortality in epilepsy can be split according to epilepsy-related and non-epilepsy-related, and it can be direct or indirect. And there are other conditions that contribute to epilepsy-associated mortality as well. And we need to think about these things in context, as I've mentioned. For example, in low-income settings, many of the newer anti-seizure medications are not available. So medications tend to be phenytoin, phenobarbital, carbamazepine, sometimes lamotrigine, valproate. And these anti-seizure medications can have effects on cholesterol metabolism, for example, contribute to vascular risk and contribute to long-term side effects. In terms of the risks from accidents, that can be extremely high. And we are familiar in high-income settings of saying that people should not have baths if they have epilepsy to try and avoid the tragedy of someone drowning in the bath. But if we think about that differently, in low-income settings, a lot of people may, for example, wash clothes in running water. And when we were in Zimbabwe and we were talking to people with epilepsy, one of the things we found is that a lot of women with epilepsy who are washing clothes were asked to wash clothes downstream of other villagers if they happen to have epilepsy. So you can imagine if you are downstream, and the reason for doing that, I should explain, is that there was concern that epilepsy was contagious, and therefore if you washed the clothes upstream, then that water would flow past the other villagers washing their clothes and they would be contaminated and contract epilepsy. However, if you're washing the clothes downstream and you then have a seizure and you fall into the water, then no one will see you. And so the risk is that much greater. Similarly, we're familiar that status epilepticus is a condition that associates with mortality, particularly if you need intensive care support, and there's a lot of systemic difficulties that result from status epilepticus. But in resource-limited settings, for example, there was a study in Honduras, 75% of people presenting with status epilepticus, there was poor concordance with medication. Now that can happen in other settings, but sometimes the poor concordance with medication is not because people choose not to take the medication, it's because the medication is not available. For example, Tanzania ran out of phenobarbital in 2022, and there was a clear correlation with an increase in deaths relating to the lack of phenobarbital in the country at that time. Suicide is overrepresented in people with epilepsy around the world. This is clearly regrettable, and there are certain associations, particularly males, temporal lobe epilepsy, if there's a comorbid psychiatric illness. But in places where epilepsy is particularly stigmatized, there can be this concept of double stigma associating with epilepsy and with a mental health disorder. Likewise, I'll touch on SUDEP just briefly because many people on this call who are more well-versed in this than I am. But one of the key things that can reduce the risk of SUDEP is if there is a bed partner. So for example, if someone has convulsive seizures and they don't share the bedroom, then the risk is particularly high. And this may be something that we can look to try and mitigate no matter which setting this occurs in. There's also, and as I've mentioned, action, we'll talk about this in detail, stigmatization and a lack of engagement. So concepts surrounding epilepsy can be very different in different communities. When I was working in London, a young gentleman with learning disability and epilepsy was brought in having experienced a seizure. And on going through the story, he couldn't really give the story, and we were trying to collate other information. And at that point, his two quite glamorous sisters attended, and they were clearly very devoted to their brother and were looking after him. And we asked, so is there any trigger as to why this seizure had happened for the first time? And then it transpired that actually he had had many seizures on many previous occasions. And the only reason he'd come to the hospital this time is he had a seizure and fell behind the door, and the family couldn't open the bathroom door to get to him, so had to call the fire brigade, who in turn called an ambulance. But the reason that that had not been declared is because the family, not so much the sisters, but the family were concerned that if they declared their son's epilepsy, then the marriage prospects for the sisters would be diminished. So there are generational differences in how you perceive epilepsy. There can be concepts relating to possession, contagion, and so on and so forth. There's also a difficulty with trust. So as I said, people may see traditional healers rather than going to medics. Costs of anti-seizure medications, loss of earnings if you go to clinic visits can lead to lack of engagement. There can be difficulties with government, as we've mentioned in Tanzania, and there can be a real lack of prioritization of epilepsy care. So what can we do? That, having presented all of that, it can seem absolutely overwhelming. We've got a really common condition that is treatable potentially, but associates with great risk, with particular risk in low to middle income countries, is deeply stigmatized, is not well prioritized by governments, and so on and so forth. So it can seem just completely overwhelming. This is a beautiful sculpture by Sarah Brown, who is a lady who has had seizures and underwent epilepsy surgery and is also an artist. This illustrates stigma related to epilepsy, how stigma can sometimes be overwhelming, need for medication, but yet how you can seem chained to medication, and so on and so forth. So what can we do? Well, I'm going to propose there's a lot we can do. It always starts with people. So we need engagement across communities. It's great to have action here, people with epilepsy, community leaders. And although there are not many neurologists in low to income settings, there are a lot of primary healthcare workers. So if we can upskill primary healthcare workers using advocacy, as is being done in Ghana here with Dr. Ajay, Professor Patrick Adshay here, educators, traditional healers need to be engaged. And it's important to engage with traditional healers. This is who people trust. So ministries of health, governments, and then better prioritize epilepsy. We can try and prevent epilepsy. This is potentially more possible in low to middle income countries than it is in the UK or the US, for example. Many causes of epilepsy are secondary to traumatic brain injury. So better obstetric care can prevent perinatal injury. Wearing seatbelts can prevent head injuries, or infections such as neurocysticercosis. So preventing those infections might reduce the incidence of epilepsy. There are two peaks in epilepsy incidence and prevalence. The higher peak in older populations often relates to stroke. And older populations are aging 3 times more quickly in low-income settings than they are in the UK, for example. So if we reduce vascular risk factors globally, but perhaps particularly in low to middle income settings, we can try and prevent this second peak. So can try and prevent epilepsy and reduce epilepsy-associated mortality. It's also important that there's very clear discussion about epilepsy. So we need to be able to ask about seizures, we need to ask about medication. And that involves not just asking people whether they're taking the medications and the adherence with the medication, but also availability. So are the drugs actually available to be prescribed and to be dispensed to people who have seizures? We should ask about provoking factors, discuss risks from seizures, injuries, talk about overnight supervision, and the broader impact of seizures as well, talking about school, family life, relationships, discrimination, and stigma. We need a multidisciplinary approach. So this is a project that we are performing with Action, who's here. Gardner is here as well. So this is the Epilepsy Pathway Innovation in Africa program, which is really trying to upskill primary healthcare workers using technologies to try and be able to deliver epilepsy care at scale. And one of the things that is very apparent is that sometimes it's not what you see. So this is a photo, again from Zimbabwe, they featured heavily tonight, So everyone in Zimbabwe uses mobile wallet. And this was the case many years ago because the currency is unstable. So when we queued to buy groceries, the only people who were paying with cash in US dollars were myself and my colleague, because everyone else was using a mobile phone. So the technology exists, and there is the potential to exploit that to try and advance epilepsy care. To do that, we need that multidisciplinary approach, though. We don't just need neurologists, we need engineers, software developers, and so on. And we need equity. So the world is very unequal, and many of you will have seen this from unequal spaces. So this is in South Africa, showing a divide across a freeway. And we're not looking for equality, but rather equity. And a great driver for this is going to be the WHO Intersectoral Global Action Plan. And Tarun Dua, who has really been instrumental in this, is also part of the APINA project. And we really want to strive for these goals. This is our time to really try and advance care of people with epilepsy, because there won't be another intersectoral action plan in another 10 years. We really have to seize the moment. So in terms of solutions, as I've said, people, particularly primary healthcare workers, projects in low and middle income settings, prioritization, prevention of epilepsy, to ask openly about the condition, discuss risk factors, how to avoid them, adherence and availability of anti-seizure medications. And we need a multidisciplinary, multinational, multidimensional approach, all of which needs to be embedded in equitable partnerships with people in low resource settings. And just in case you haven't seen what I've done there, that obviously matches very closely with what we're discussing tonight. And we can move then from not just equality and equity to liberation, because there should be no barriers at all to trying to improve the care for people with epilepsy. So in conclusion, epilepsy is a condition that associates with an increased risk of morbidity and mortality. That risk is manifestly higher in low and middle income settings. But there are multiple things we can all do to help, even if initially it can seem a little overwhelming. Always important to remember that epilepsy is more than seizures alone, associating with cognitive difficulties, psychological difficulties, social difficulties, and stigmatization, which Action will explore in detail. And I would contend that epilepsy does remain the most common serious neurological condition. And this is drawn by one of our patients, saying that it is very much time to wake up to epilepsy. And I'll leave you with some final pictures of Oxford just to illustrate that on occasions it is sunny here. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Arjune, for that presentation. And I'm going to talk about epilepsy stigma in Africa. Maybe before I get into my detailed presentation, I just want to give you just two warnings. My iPad, which I'm used for connecting, has got a fault camera. So you might see me shaking at times, and when I start shaking, don't panic. It's not a seizure, but it's actually the fault camera that I started experiencing this afternoon. And secondly, if you hear me starting to whisper, there's a saying in my country that says, the night has got ears. So we fear so much wishes that at times we don't speak loud because it's night here. So I thought I should just warn you of that. So I'm going to talk about stigma. And why did I talk about witches? We are a continent that is much more clouded with beliefs, cultural beliefs, and most of the things that we do based on certain cultural beliefs. And that has also effect even to people with epilepsy themselves. So in this presentation, I'm just going to talk about stigma and what is stigma. I know most of you know about stigma, but I'll try to define it in a different way today, and also just share with you some of the evidence around stigma and discrimination that's happening within Africa. And also, I'm going to share with you some of the experience, how persons with epilepsy are experiencing stigma in Africa, and also share with you some evidence on how we can overcome stigma. Maybe we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so that's the outline of what I've just mentioned. So to start with, what is stigma? So just as we all know that no one would want to attach themselves and talk about stigma or be associated with stigma or be defined by it. So here I define it as a problem, but the problem is in three levels. One is the problem of knowledge. As Professor Arjune was presenting, he highlighted some of the lack of knowledge that is there in the communities. For example, he cited an example which is common across Africa, where if somebody is washing their clothes and they have epilepsy, they should not do it upstream. They should do it downstream, because they fear that if somebody gets into contact with the water that has washed the clothes of somebody with epilepsy, they will also get epilepsy. That's lack of knowledge. Personally, as when I started having seizures, and we had to visit witch doctors, which was our first point of entry in trying to get treatment. I got quite a lot of suggested solutions on how my seizures were going to be reduced. There was one time that we were told that I needed not to eat things such as chicken wings, because as the chicken flips, that again, they said it would increase my seizures. At times, I had to be forced to bath at crossroads in a village path, because they said they wanted to cleanse my epilepsy at a crossroad or at a cross path, so that the demon or the evil spirits that are in me would get confused and do not know which of those crossroads paths they would take. So that again tells you a story about a lack of knowledge, ignorance itself. Then we have a problem of attitudes. So attitudes associated to whether you're at work, at school, people might just prejudice you because you have epilepsy. Then stigma also can be defined as a problem of behavior, discrimination. People discriminate quite a lot in communities, in economic life. Persons with epilepsy are actually discriminated against. I can cite an example from my country, Malawi, where in a village there is a program for subsidized fertilizer or subsidy for farming inputs. So if you have epilepsy, you have no chance of receiving any of those subsidized farming inputs, because they'll say, well, what are you going to do with those farming inputs because you have epilepsy? If a woman has epilepsy and is known at a health center, and here we're talking about professionals, they'll ask the lady with epilepsy or the woman with epilepsy questions such as, well, you have epilepsy. How did you get this? So such questions actually indicate that there is high discrimination. And that's how I would simply define stigma that we are experiencing as persons with epilepsy in Africa. Can move on to the next slide. Just now to give you some evidence that really it's existing within Africa. Here I'm citing something that happened last year in the last quarter of the year, in September 2022 in Kenya. Here there's a letter that was written to a parent, and I'll read it quickly. It says, "Your report to us that your son suffers a health condition was kindly noted by the administration. However, close observation of your son's behavior tells a different story altogether. In class portrays stretches, contortions, and grimaces befitting a person possessed with evil spirits. From the manner in which he stretches and folds his hands, how he opens and closes his eyes, folds his face, shapes his mouth, and produces strange moans. He scares his classmates to an extent that they run away from him. No one dares to touch him in that situation. Kindly note that he cannot be retained in school in his current state. Have him attended to the right way and furnish us with a report that is well before he can be readmitted into school. Should the condition persist, it will be hard to readmit him." And there's a stamp of the school. The school is in Kenya, and the headmaster signs that. So what does this show us? So here we see an example of institutional stigma in a school. We see also what we would call societal stigma, classmates and so forth. We see ignorance, we see attitude, we see stigma. We'll come back to this example later to see, demonstrate that we can overcome such kinds of stigma as they happen. The next example I'm going to share with you, again from Kenya, is of Eve, as you see here on the picture, a beautiful girl. However, Eve was not stigmatized by anyone. Mainly, it was a self-imposed stigma, up to the end that she thought of committing suicide, according to her own narration. Nobody had talked about stigmatizing her, or maybe things that she had just that unknown fear that I have these, maybe at school, what's going to happen? She was at college, am I going to get married? And all sorts of things that kept on. And she kept on isolating yourself. So that again is a demonstration of stigma that exists. And we'll come back again to this case study to show how epilepsy stigma can be overcome. Another example in the next slide is about Jessie. Jessie is a mother with epilepsy in Zambia. And the unfortunate part of Jessie is that she's a single mother, which is not there for the very unfortunate part of it. But the unfortunate part of it, she's got a child, a boy of school-going age, who has also epilepsy. So Jessie, when she was diagnosed with epilepsy, she was told that it was a case that had been caused by bewitchment. And she traveled across the breadth of Zambia, meeting different witch doctors, trying to get away, to wash away the case that had been put on her. However, that did not help until she realized what her condition was. And we'll come back to this case. And that did not only help herself, it also later in life when she had a child, helped the child currently who is also having epilepsy. All this shows examples of stigmatization that can happen either through ignorance, attitudes, or through discrimination. But how is it experienced? In the next slide, we'll show you in 3 key levels in which stigma happens. One, institutional. We have cited an example of a school, and it's not only in schools, even in families. A family is an institution. Stigma happens. Self-imposed. One can, be sentencing themselves to stigma throughout their life by imposing it on themselves. Then comes the societal, which is the bigger part or takes the bigger percentage of the stigma that we experience as persons with epilepsy. Further, let's break it down now to see how it's experienced. Let's start with home in the next slide. Here, we see that within the home, that's the entry point where stigma starts to affect those that have epilepsy. It could be through the language that is used. When something goes wrong or something's done wrongly, people try to, name and shame you because you have epilepsy. You're regarded as a lazy person, as a weak person, as bewitched, as having a demon, and so forth. And it starts within the home, which is an entry point to our social interactions. And also within the family, there could be negative reactions to the family members themselves. I know in my case, when I was diagnosed with epilepsy or I started having seizures, my parents were accused of maybe trying to become wealthy and now trying to put me as a sacrifice so that maybe as I have seizures or as I have, epilepsy episodes, it will be something that will be happening at those moments. They will be generating money. We don't know how the two were linked. So it can have negative reactions to the families themselves. Also, in the communities, persons with epilepsy are discounted. So you have no value at all. You become abnormal. You are excluded in development initiatives. I told you about the farm input subsidy, where people are totally not regarded as somebody that they call normal. There is no kind of economic activity around you, no budgets, even within the community initiatives that happen. How about at work in the next slide? So when you declare that you have epilepsy, you have low rates of being shortlisted or getting hired. If you don't declare and you have episodes during the work, like say, you don't get the same rate as others. You also, as you'll be working also, your chances of getting promoted are very low, and you try to conceal it, and it's a dilemma, not to disclose, because at times these seizures, they can even happen while it's at work. In the media, when we did an analysis of reports in the media, we noted that 40 to 70% of what's reported in the media is more to do with violence that happens either attributed that the causer is a person with epilepsy. And they would not even say a person with epilepsy, they will say maybe it's a person with a mental disorder. And at times it's the violence that is perpetrated against us as persons with epilepsy. 50% of cases that are reported are much more to do with victimization. So a child is raped, a woman is raped, a woman with epilepsy, but there isn't much that is reported about the good things that persons with epilepsy will do. I am a a graduate myself, those stories would not see the light of the day. I've got children, I have a job, I do some economic activities. Those things do not see light in our media. That again is a clear demonstration that even the media stigmatizes persons with epilepsy. In the next slide, at school, this is one of the bad grounds for stigma, because children, they can be easily affected by what happens around them at school. You might find that some can go to an extent of even dropping out of school. So this is caused by friends, schoolmates, through verbal abuse, and also at times it's reactions by family. So once they hear stories happening about their children, they will decide to discontinue them to go to school or stop them from going to school. And it's worse for a girl child, because as a girl child, families, they don't kind of want to invest in you so that you continue with your education. They would rather invest in a boy child with epilepsy as compared to a girl child. And also, one of the main reasons why a lot of children with epilepsy do not continue school in Africa, it's mainly because of distances from home to school. And in between, parents fear that our child is going to have seizures, and they stop them from going into school. But is there evidence that stigma can be overcome, or we can overcome a stigma? Yes, there is. In the next slide, I go back to those cases that I talked about, the dismissal letter. So this came through the EPINA project, and one of the partners within the EPINA project that Professor Arjune mentioned is an organization which is affiliated to IB called Kenya Association for Welfare of Epilepsy. And they wrote a letter to the school head threatening litigation against the school head and the school. And within a week, the child went back to school. So we can, overcome stigma. Jesse in Zambia that I showed you that went, across the whole of Zambia looking for a solution for her epilepsy cause. Again, when she got in touch with the Epilepsy Association of Zambia, she was trained and became an advocate, and not only trained, but also went on to start accessing medication. At first, she says the medication she was getting were not quite helping her, but at one point she hit a good note, and the medication she started receiving actually assisted her. And as we speak now, she's a university graduate. She's working. She's, I would say, a lecturer currently, and her child also, her seizures are also reduced. And now everybody associates with her well as a mother at church and at work as well. And she has a privilege even of traveling across Africa with her work. So this shows that stigma can be overcome. We talked about Eve, who self-isolated herself, again, through association with others, peer mentorship. She managed also to overcome the challenge that she has. And what are the other things that can be done so that we can overcome stigma? Well, we need to support stigma campaigns. So we can learn from other campaigns that have been done where people have been stigmatized. We can talk about HIV/AIDS. There was a lot of stigma against persons with HIV/AIDS, and there were a lot of campaigns. But what made those campaigns successful? It was mainly to do with the support that was provided. So partners, coalitions, alliances were formed for one cause, to ensure that Not only were they fighting the condition itself and its causes, but also the stigma that was attached to it. And in no history of health have we had such massive support in terms of fighting stigma as we evidenced in the early 90s and late 2000s, where there was good support for stigma campaigns against HIV/AIDS. We also need trainings. There's a training for advocates, training for health professionals. And when we talk about health professionals, especially in Africa, we can talk even about community volunteers, the first line people. They also need to learn more about epilepsy stigma so that they assist these people as they refer them to the health centers. We also need to engage persons with epilepsy themselves to be role models, to show others that, well, if support, diagnosis gaps are addressed, treatment gaps are addressed, these people, they can live a life that many people call normal without being stigmatized. As an organization, in the next slide, there has been a lot of efforts that have been done, and I want to thank our key partners, BENT Foundation, International League Against Epilepsy, that we have worked with over the years, but especially BENT Foundation for all the support that they've poured into Africa. We have managed to come up with a specific toolkit that focuses on stigma. And in it, there are even examples on how stigma can be addressed from a family level, so community level, and institutional level. And there are lived experiences in it on how some have been stigmatized and how they overcame that stigmatization that was attached to them. We have an advocacy toolkit again, which also complements the stigma toolkit and gives a lot of solutions on how engagements can be done to ensure that people that perpetrate stigmatization are talked to, are engaged, and are held accountable for their actions. And it is a tool that is being used across Africa now to train other advocates to help people with epilepsy in their communities. And I'm happy to say, as we speak, this now has been adopted in Latin America as a toolkit for use there as well. We have mapped laws within Africa that are also discriminating and stigmatizing, and I can cite one, such a law in Tanzania, where it says a woman can be divorced if they experience seizures or they have epilepsy. And we have challenged this law and will continue to challenge it in 2023 through the Parliament of Tanzania so that this law can be repealed. This is just a demonstration that even laws themselves, the legal framework, can actually stigmatize persons with epilepsy. Well, I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you to both of our speakers. On behalf of PAME, you really did a great job of outlining some of the challenges faced by low and middle income countries, and certainly learning a lot about the challenges of people with epilepsy and facing stigma in different countries in Africa. So thank you both for speaking for this PAME webinar. And just knowing we're looking at time, so we are going to end the webinar here. If anyone does have questions, please email PAME@aesnet.org, and we could do our best to answer those. We're not able to comment on specific patient questions, but we would try to work if there's questions you have on data or resources. Thank you again for joining, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.